Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
Hello, this is John Bicknell, host of the Cognitive Crucible. I want to give a short introduction to this holiday bonus episode and set the stage for 2021. Loyal listeners of the Cognitive Crucible, and thank you very much, by the way, know that podcast guests include military information operators, scholars, authors, and innovative business leaders. In addition to discussing their own work and experiences related to cognitive security and information warfare, I try to ask all guests if they can recommend a book or other online resource that listeners may check out in order to get a deeper dive about the episode topic. And then we include links in each episode's show notes to make it easier to get a hold of the item. So for this episode, we've pulled out the clips in which our guests present the very best books and online resources related to the discussion at hand, and which touch upon various aspects of the cognitive security challenge that we face. Frequently, these portions of the episode bring together concepts into a nice, neat little package, which is helpful too, and may inspire you to go back to the episode and give it another listen. We launched the Cognitive Crucible back in September of 2020, and I'm really happy and humbled with some of the feedback that we've gotten. And I want to keep the momentum going into 2021 and beyond. Based upon listener analytics, it appears that this podcast is reaching governmental and military leaders, both in uniform and in the civilian workforce. And it's becoming somewhat of an informal professional military education or PME channel. One of the things we hear occasionally is that the United States is guilty of, quote unquote, admiring the problem and doing too little to counter the information and cognitive threat. Well, here at the Information Professionals Association, we have some meaningful initiatives planned for 2021 and beyond, which will put action behind our words. So stay tuned as we will be discussing these on upcoming episodes. But before we get into the book recommendations, I want to pass along to you some ways that you, dear listener, can contribute starting now. First, be sure to tell your friends and family about this podcast and your professional colleagues and encourage them to subscribe. As I've mentioned numerous times on the podcast, IPA is interested in fomenting a whole of society or whole of government effort to counter the information problem. So reaching broader audiences is a critical part of this agenda. Next, please rate the podcast and leave a review on iTunes or whatever platform you get podcasts on. It really does help, and it takes just a few moments of your time. IPA is especially active on LinkedIn. So on the LinkedIn platform, please go to our company page and click the follow button. And not only does this mean that you'll see all of our LinkedIn content, but it also provides a signal to the LinkedIn algorithm that our activity is of interest and relevant. And then the algorithm sends our content out to a wider audience. Next, and sticking with LinkedIn, please engage with our content on LinkedIn. You can share our posts with your network and add thoughtful comments as well. And it is not only okay, but it's even desirable to have respectful debate, good faith discussions about the content that we put out on LinkedIn. All of this would be very helpful. Next, and this is taking things to another level, but we would be delighted for you to write a blog article for us. We are very interested in your thought leadership. If you've got something interesting to share with the world, then please send it to us and we'll review it for our blog, and we can have a dialogue back and forth about getting that published on our blog. The same thing regarding this podcast itself. We are especially interested to have experts on the podcast to discuss relevant information and cognitive security topics which have not yet been covered. Here's a for example. The Marine Corps, and of course I'm a bit partial to the Marine Corps being a retired Marine myself, but the Marine Corps just published Marine Corps Doctrinal Pub 1-4, which is called Competing. Sometime early in 2021, I plan to have an episode dedicated to that topic, perhaps interviewing the authors of the Competing Marine Corps Pub, which they make the case that examining the conflict space as a competition continuum is critical to the way that we think about engaging in the world today. And here's another thing that you can do to help. And by the way, you can file this under the heading of communication transparency. Here at IPA, we use what are called Amazon affiliate links within our show notes. These links map back to the Amazon platform, and it means that we get a small bit of revenue from Amazon by driving traffic to their site. So if you go to the Cognitive Crucible show notes and you click on one of the book links, then Amazon will pay us a little bit of money for essentially being part of their customer experience. So that's a very easy way for you to help as well. Of course, you can also join IPA. IPA members get access to the members only section of our website with members only content and access to the members directory. Plus, members are the first to know about upcoming events. And here's another idea for you to consider. Become a corporate sponsor. There is no better way to signal to your shareholders and boards of directors that you get it, that you get that we are in the throes of a generational challenge and you are putting money behind your words. Of course, it goes without saying that corporate sponsors get their logos displayed prominently on conference materials, but corporate sponsors also get unique exposure to governmental leaders in venues like the upcoming Phoenix Challenge, which is co-sponsored by IPA and the University of Maryland's Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security, also known as ARLIS. All right, well, that is enough out of me for now. On behalf of IPA, again, thank you all for listening and engaging. And now here are the book and other online resource material recommendations from the Cognitive Crucible guests so far. As usual, see our show notes webpage for links to these resources, and we hope you find this useful. The Cognitive Crucible podcast kicked off in September with Dr. Rand Waltzman, who is one of the leading authorities on cognitive security.
Well, the first thing I would recommend, there's a documentary called The Century of the Self. And it's 4 hours long, and you can see it on YouTube. Don't look at the shortened version. You have to look at the full 4 hours, and it is worth every minute of your time to sit and watch it. And one of the things that is really great about it is it isn't pushing it's not pushing a political agenda. It's showing you techniques. It's a focus on technique. How does things actually work? How do you do things? I mean, like, for example, when I talk about things, examples that I tend to use are not modern day examples because people are emotionally invested in modern day examples, and it tends to cloud their vision and make them not pay attention to the point of the discussion, which is the techniques. So in this documentary, the examples that they are talking about are all old. So people are not going to be that emotionally invested in them. So it's really the focus on techniques. And it's a really beautiful exposition of it. The next thing, one of the main characters in the early part of this is a guy named Edward Bernays, who was considered to be one of the founders of the whole field of modern field of public relations. And in 1928, he wrote a book called Propaganda, a little book, just a couple hours reading. And after you watch this documentary, you should actually sit down and read this book. That's the next thing. Mm-hmm. And then I would recommend a book called very recent book called Computational Propaganda, which is edited by Sam Woolley and Phil Howard. Phil Howard is at the Oxford Internet Institute, and it gives you a very good broad overview of how this whole business works. So that would be my recommendation to get started.
Nice.
The literature in the field is enormous.
Next, Austin Branch, who holds the distinction for being the U.S. Army's first information operations officer, discusses some of his go-to reading materials.
I got introduced to these ideas of competition in the complex information environment and its and the strategies and its role and importance early on in 1995 when I started in the command and control warfare space. When a boss of mine handed me some of the Toffler books and Alvin and Heidi Toffler, as they were looking into the future, future shock, third wave, war and anti-war, and all the challenges that we are seeing today, right? And so that really kind of got me interested, and then I kind of juxtaposed those kind of big thoughts onto the operational environment I was experiencing back then and what I imagined might be in the future. And so that inspired me to study more and to get more deeply involved. And then, quite frankly, I became incredibly proud and honored to be, luckily one of the group of pioneers in this space where we were carving out what works, what doesn't work, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, watching our adversaries evolve. How do you organize for these things? So a lot to read out there, but the reality is, this is not going away. It's only going to become more complex and more challenging. Competition in the global information environment is being advanced by extraordinary technology and even more extraordinary breakthroughs on the horizon. So this is definitely the knowledge age and information age. Mm-hmm. So if that's in fact the truth, which it is, then we most certainly need to understand how to operate, and compete, and win.
Mr. Chris McPherson is a national security and business innovator and thought leader. He stopped by the Cognitive Crucible and shared one of his favorite books on innovation.
There's a book by Steven Johnson who's written a couple of very interesting books, but this one is his recent one called Farsighted. And Steven Johnson's done work. I think he works at the Long Now Institute out of San Francisco, but he's also done things with the Santa Fe Institute. And in the defense communities, those are some of the quantitative powerhouses of thinking about the future, right? Next generation mathematics. And he brings out a couple examples about how it's this general concept of that we have just begun maybe the third stage of human innovation, right? Mm-hmm. And so if the first one was this idea of being able to communicate ideas to each other, was the first step, right? Like we have an idea in our head, expressing that to other people, being to do that, being able to write it down, then and pass it on to other people after us was the next one. Yep. And then we're getting to this idea of prediction, and so in the past we've always used this idea of fiction as a very powerful tool to imagine future possibilities. But what we've noticed in the last maybe 70 years is this concept that as mathematics and compute power and data, we can actually think about and predict things that are going to happen in the future with some relative certainty. And so the easiest example, I think the most powerful example of what technology can do for us in the future as a population is the way meteorological models have developed, right? Where, in the 1890s, we could predict the weather for tomorrow 6 days from now. Like we had enough data to actually predict with some level of accuracy if it was going to rain tomorrow, but it took us 6 days to compute the equations in order for us to prove it. And they're like, that's not super useful.
We did it. Yay.
But it's gotten to the point now where, in the 2000s, we could know what the weather was going to be like for the weekend. In 2010, we know what it was going to be like next weekend. And we're at the level now where we can, in some parts of the world, we can predict weather relatively high confidence, like 10 to 13 days in advance, which is crazy. And and we actually believe we might be able to do it 30 days in advance at some point in the future. So imagine what that means. And when you look at hurricane models, you see, or even COVID, when we talked about the different predictive models, we have gotten so far, but it shows us how much we don't know at some times too, right? But it's this idea of how we can use simulation to become powerful arbiters of how we think about our society that we want to build in the future. Because when you built the pyramids, the pharaohs didn't build the pyramids because they're like, this is how I think cities are going to use my pyramid 200 years from now. They built them as artifacts to themselves. Now we're actually building cities for people that aren't even alive yet to live in. And so this concept, I think for me, and also how information works and how you make decisions based on this and the temporality of different kinds of decisions, we're really starting to get advanced enough to know what decisions get made, you make on a day-to-day basis versus a month basis versus a year basis versus a life basis. And thinking about those are different kinds of decisions. And when you think about it from a cognitive security standpoint, they either compound towards each other or they're completely different ways of operating that we would need to adapt messaging and environment shaping to, which could be very powerful for all of our listeners.
Yeah, that sounds like a fascinating read, but also a deterministic take on being able to predict the future. It's like if we know enough about where all of the atoms are arranged in this moment and their velocities and momentums and et cetera, we can use that with our ever-growing compute power to make better and better predictions going forward.
Yeah, and all we have to do to improve is, remember, our baseline is human ability to do that.
That's right, yes.
And so in order for that to be better, we just have to be better than how well we can guess what the weather is going to be like tomorrow for that to be an effective system.
Mr. Tony Squirrel, who is CEO of Ed Ventures, has had some very impactful global engagements at the intersection between education, terrorism, and information operations. He shares an excellent book which touches upon these themes.
Yeah, I really enjoyed a book written by Clint Watts, a former FBI special agent, Army officer, and leading cybersecurity expert, called Messing with the Enemy. And John, I picked it up because when we got the work with Ukraine, and knowing specifically that it was focused around Russian propaganda, social media, and hacking, this book was made in heaven for me. And it's great, number one. But I like it because he actually has two things that I think were very interesting. One is, he said, we need like a seal of approval, a consumer report that could be given to media outlets that verifies that they're doing things correctly. Fake news, fiction, subjective opinion versus objective reporting. That's pretty cool. I mean, I think that's great. It's like an industry standard. And then he also, to help the layman, he developed these protocols. It's like a cookbook, a recipe of different areas of involvement, like competency, motivation, product, and process, that we all should be deploying when we see something where the slightest amount of doubt says, you know what, I'm not going to take that for gospel. I'm actually going to have my antennae go up and I'm going to do some homework. He has like a methodology to determine, is this fake news? Author verification, and a number of other elements that allow us to become knowledgeable and media literate instead of gullible consumers of fake news. The book is great. The book is superb.
Next, Professor Bob Thibodeau of Carnegie Mellon University discusses his research on lies and cognition.
I came to understand the role of lying in the preservation of privacy. There's actually one chapter toward the end of the book on privacy that has to do with lying. And I swore to my wife that within the year, I would write an entire book on lying. Okay.
You promised this to your wife?
Yeah, because she was watching me write the other book, and I said, and people were trying to tell me, do not talk about lying. They don't want. Nobody wants to hear about it. And I said, this is like really important.
It's not big, not a big topic on the cocktail party scene.
No. So I have a argument that says basically that at least 40% of the people out there, the second you say that you're studying lying, don't want to talk to you at all. Okay. People don't like talking about lying, but I see it from a scientific point of view and understanding how the brain computes. And in terms of that, I think we can learn a lot by a scientific approach to lying. And for example, not a game theory approach, but a scientific approach as to how it's computed in the neocortex, how lying works.
Mr. Ben Riley is a retired Navy officer and government senior executive who now works at Georgia Tech. He makes the case for innovation by drawing on military history.
One that I have enjoyed through the years was given to me is a book entitled Monitor. It's a story about the designer of it, Ericsson, who was a Swedish, born in Sweden, and how he came ultimately to the United States. And he actually had proposed the design and the idea of Monitor well before the Civil War. And
is that right?
He kept on, in the war started, he kept on pushing the idea. The Navy and the Navy establishment resisted everything he did. And ultimately, the Secretary of the Navy and I guess President Lincoln all took an interest in this, and they sort of ramrodded through. The Navy made a series of specifications as to what it should do, and it should have masts and sails and stuff like this, all of which Ericsson ignored when he built the ship. But ultimately, the construction of the ship was sped up because the Confederacy had captured the Norfolk Navy shipyard, and they had resurrected one of the ships there and made it into their own ironclad, which they called the Virginia, or we call the Merrimack, which was the original name of the ship that the hull was built on. And their objective was to go out and break the Union blockade of Hampton Roads, Virginia, to enable other nations and the Confederacy to trade with Europe, notably in cotton, which apparently was something that the industries and the mills and so on in Europe were very, very interested in.
Yeah, I understand cotton was a big deal back then.
And so the Monitor's departure from Brooklyn, New York, down to that area was sped up, and it arrived the day after the Merrimack came out and had sunk or disabled a number of U.S. Navy ships in the area, either by ramming them and everything. The ship proved to be impervious to gunfire from the U.S. Navy ships, apparently, and so it had gone out, wreaked havoc in Hampton Roads, and then had gone in for the night, planning to come out the next day. Well, that night or the next morning, the Monitor arrives on the scene, and these two ships engage in a battle, which probably ended in a standoff. But the Navy, the Navy had resisted the whole idea of doing this thing until external forces came in, and then urgency made it the only solution to deal with the Merrimack when it did come out. In the book, the author points out that 2 weeks after the battle, when the Royal Navy heard about the battle, they canceled all of their contracts for wooden naval vessels.
Wow!
And they changed, from wood to steel to iron, I guess. And it was just how much it took to overcome resistance to sort of standard thinking and a way of doing business. The Monitor only had 2 guns on it, big ones, but 2 guns, and a rotating turret. The Merrimack had, I think it was 18, quite a few guns.
Mm-hmm.
The Monitor could outshoot it, though, because the Merrimack's guns were all tied to the keel of the ship. And so to aim the guns, you had to maneuver the ship. And the Merrimack wasn't very maneuverable, as it turned out. Whereas with the Monitor, you didn't need to maneuver the ship. You maneuvered the turret, and you just rotated the turret around. So it actually, with only 2 guns, could produce a pretty rapid rate of fire as compared to the Merrimack. So it was just kind of an interesting little thing. But nobody, for some reason, nobody ever thought about that, I guess. And it never really attracted people's attention. So, so I
innovation is innovation and innovative mindset is, I think, a critical capability that needs to be advanced significantly. And this is I guess a cautionary tale along those lines. And I'm sure history is I mean, again, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I'm sure that there are a number of occasions throughout history where the same kind of laggard mindset or whoever was in charge at the time just couldn't quite see past the status quo into new possibilities.
So I just tie that to a memo I found to my boss Larry Lynn in the Pentagon. This is go back to 1993, by the way, just
to mark it. Yep.
But it was a memo from a gentleman named Andy Marshall, who headed the OSD Office of Net Assessment, and Andy was an internationally known figure, and he wrote my boss Larry Lynn a memo on this new concept called information warfare and the implications of it for the future. And in the memo, he speculates that it might be something that's very hard for DOD, the Department of Defense, to adapt to because it doesn't really fit into the way of DOD thinking, if you will. So in a sense, there's a link between that memo, in my head at least, and the resistance and the challenge that Erickson and the Monitor faced when they started to build this ship, and the importance that each of them actually generated. The Monitor, of course, changing a lot of naval thinking, and information warfare now being a huge factor in pretty much every facet of life.
Next, retired U.S. Army Colonel Randyosine, who is now a faculty member at the National Intelligence University, as well as a strategic communications PhD candidate. He shares his essential books that everyone who is interested in communications should read.
I think one of the most switched on communication scholars that really gets it about the impact of information and communication technology is Manuel Castells. And in his book, Communication Power, and I would recommend that to anybody who's interested. Number one, what we're really talking about is less information, but more communication. And communication from the standpoint of creating meaning, that we as human beings work with other human beings to create meaning about our world. I mean, we all have our own personal realities, but when we talk about at the societal level, we're working with other human beings to figure out what's going on. Mm-hmm. Now that's as opposed and so you have you can say like the prevalent powers, or be it corporate or government or adversaries, what have you, they're trying to affect the way that we create meaning. And the way that they try and affect that is through the communication process. So it's really important to understand that. And one of Castells' going in propositions in the book is that the shaping of minds is a more decisive and lasting form of domination than the submission of bodies by intimidation or violence. So it is through communication that power is exerted, and it's important to recognize that at the end of the day, how we create meaning is really what you're trying to get after in terms of operations in the information environment. So this is Communication Power. It's a great book. He also has another series of books called The Network Society. And so he talks about how the information communication technology through the creation of networks has fundamentally altered how we organize ourselves and exchange information. And that's also reflected in network-centric warfare. So in, giving the Toffler thing about, the way we make money is the way we make war, there you have it.
Here is Mr. Duan Lee, who recaps the books that he finds to be most interesting and relevant to disinformation. Duan is the Senior Director of Research and Strategy at Signal Labs, and he's also a national security thought leader.
And my first recommendation would be, and full disclosure, I've known Peter Singer for a while, so I may come across a little bit partial, but I do think that he is the best futurist we've had in our generation. So Like War by Peter Singer is already about 2 years old, but it is essentially becoming this contemporary manifestation of what we're going through right now, right? Because he's essentially talking about the weaponization of social media and digital media data, right? And even though it's 2 years old, if you read it right now, you'll be shocked how many, analogous, incidents we're experiencing right now. So I think it's a must for all, information warfare, stakeholders, analysts, planners, right? In fact, I think it is a mandatory reading for a lot of military training programs at this point. And he has a new book just came out this year. It's called Burn In. I think it's also a must because Burn In addresses the social and political implications of, AI and automation technology, right? How it's going to redefine politics, how it's going to redefine, public safety, how it's going to redefine law enforcement. So I think those are great books to read, right now. And there's also a more diplomacy related, book on information warfare, and it's called Information Wars by Rick Stengel. He was the longest serving, I think, Deputy Secretary for the State Department. So he understands how perhaps our peer competitors use information operations as a predominantly primary strategic tool, right? And, I want to re-emphasize that notion, right? We are coming back to that notion a couple of times, but, we really have to understand the reach and the cost effectiveness of information warfare in our DNA, right? Yep. And again, increasing connectivity, and the proliferation of digital technology and so on and so forth. A missile is really expensive, but a tweet can reach potentially millions of people, thousands, tens of thousands of miles away, right? To me, that is really the best remote warfare weapon system, period.
During our first podcast, which featured two guests, U.S. Army Colonel Mike Jackson and Dr. Paul Lieber suggest a book which illuminates important thought processes related to Cambridge Analytica's activities during the 2016 U.S. election.
A good book, a reference that I do make, pardon language, but it's called Mindfuck by Chris Wiley, talks about Cambridge Analytica. It's not what happened. It's the ability and how the thought process was made to manipulate information that is so fascinating, as we as information professionals really need to understand. Now you flash forward where you had the vulnerability of target audiences. You moved into the COVID environment where people stopped interacting face to face. They became more isolated into their social media space and these other spaces. And it's a whole new world now. And it's very fascinating to understand. And I think that's when you go into the great power competitions, the ability to communicate with specific target audiences, but also, do we really understand the vulnerability of those target audiences and the way our adversaries are able to either make it more complicated for them, but how does it also make it easier for them to manipulate information? We really need to understand that. So like I said, we are in a brave new world right now that we really need to understand.
Actually, I'm going to counter that last point that Mike had and agree with the rest. I don't think we're in a brave new world. In fact, this world has been around for decades. We're just finally admitting that that it's there. And I know Mike is agreeing with me on this, because I know we've had conversations on it. It's the notion that in great power competition that we have potential adversaries or competitors at best that are willing to use information in ways that and willing to approach it in terms of an overall strategy, be it through strategic communication, a systematic process of disseminating information, creating engagements, applying the information, making decisions on it, and mixing that with other strategic and tactical types of initiatives. They're willing and able, and they've been doing it for decades. We're finally now, out of necessity, faced with, the recognizance that we can't sit still any longer and just try to, admire the problem by throwing resources and capability at it without actually looking in the mirror and stating, what can we do? I'm not talking about being nefarious or going beyond what, authorities are there. You don't have to do that. It's actually accepting the fact that there are better ways to conduct business, which goes back to my original point on, you don't turn around and throw the baby with the bathwater. You don't throw them out. And part of the challenges that I'm seeing is in realizing that, especially in information operations, that prior approaches weren't necessarily compatible with the way our peer competitors think about the world. It doesn't mean you turn around and dismiss all those contributions. Rather, you repurpose what we're doing, and the individuals that are associated with it harness their skills and start trusting more in information as literally a phenomenon and approaching it from that perspective, not as a tool or or a bullet that you just use. I think we've been doing that for far too long, and in doing so, we've undermined our ability to create.
Our next guest, author Tom Kent, was president of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty until 2018, and he now teaches Russian affairs and disinformation at Columbia University. His book suggestions draw on his experiences.
I would recommend, to begin with, an old book, but one that's a real classic in the area, and that's Black Boomerang by Sefton Delmer. It's hard to get copies of, but you can read it on scywar.org, and it's a story of British black propaganda in World War II. Radio stations that purported to be in Germany that weren't really in Germany, disinformation operations by the British, things that people would be shocked now if you suggested the United States ought to do, but the people who did it then are now viewed as heroes in the war against Nazi Germany. On the ethics front, I'd certainly recommend Do Morals Matter by Joseph Nye, the very distinguished American diplomat and author who talks about the moral aspects of policy. What kind of moral test should we apply to American policy? And then probably also The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disorder by Sean McFate, who teaches at the National Defense University. He asks a lot of questions about our current military structure. Are we really prepared for an information war? Does DoD think about information the way it should? And where is war going?
Next, communications professor Dr. Udo Jacob discusses a recently published book on persuasion.
I particularly like Robert Cialdini's books, and his most recent book, Persuasion: A Revolutionary Way to Influence and Persuade, is a fascinating book because he talks about how we are prepared for persuasion. So the communication of persuasion, or the message that persuades, is important, but not as important as the preparation for that. So how can societies, individuals, and communities be prepared to, or be framed, if you like, to be in the sort of social, cultural, or political position to receive a particular message? Because look, no matter how beautiful a message is crafted, no matter how great it is, I mean, if it is met with a closed door or shut ears, that message will fall flat on its back, and that is what Robert Cialdini tries to bring forward in his book Persuasion. And I think, although his books generally meant for consumers and marketers of products, I think there are some specific lessons that can emerge from there, particularly for people working within the space of influence operations and information operations generally.
Mr. Johannes Tamakand is the CEO of Sentinel AI, an Estonia-based AI firm which is on the front lines of disinformation and technologies for detecting and countering deep fakes.
We just released the most comprehensive report on the state of deepfakes. What is their growth? What are the sort of the threat landscape, and where is it all going? So, and that can be freely available on our homepage. So that would be the sentinel.ai. Okay. And from a book side, to sort of understand what is happening at the moment, especially with the sort of the ideological subversion and changing the perception of reality, I recommend a book called Disinformation by Ion Mihai Bashepa. And he is the most highest ranked Soypluk defector in sort of the intelligence aspect. And he sort of lays it exactly out. What did the Soviet Union did with their sort of disinformation operations campaigns, and what was sort of their approach to that? And if we sort of understand the history, then we can also start to predict or much better understand how will it sort of evolve as well.
Marine Corps Colonel Brian Russell suggests an online National Defense University resource which examines gray zone and hybrid challenges.
I would point all of your listeners to anything Frank Hoffman writes on the gray zone. Security researcher at National Defense University. You can actually pull his article examining complex forms of conflict. It's actually in Prism Magazine, Volume 7, back in 2018. And he provides a couple definitions. The first one relates more to intent. I think we all think gray zone operations are those things non-state or nation-state actors conduct to avoid conflict, keep things below the threshold of hostilities or armed conflict. And that is certainly true. And in that case, I think gray zone operations have been a reality for quite some time for our nation. But his specific definition that I'm going to quote, because I think it's really impactful as it relates to information operations, is based on activity of gray zone operations. And that is, to quote, those covert or illegal activities of non-traditional statecraft that are below the threshold of armed organized violence, including disruption of order, political subversion of government or non-governmental organizations, psychological operations, abuse of legal processes, and financial corruption as part of an integrated design to achieve strategic advantage, end quote. And again, I like that definition because it focuses on the activities and relates exactly to what a lot of the things we talk about in the article about the importance of partnerships across the government. If your adversary is taking a financial approach, why wouldn't you want to partner with the Department of Treasury as early as possible to get after that problem set? If it's a legal approach, why not partner with the Department of Justice? Don't wait for conflict to arise and partner with those entities. Let's do it now in a long-term, sustained campaign. As it relates to the information environment, John, I think there's a couple things that have changed with modern information technology. One is this concept of reach, the ability of an adversary like ISIS to reach into our home nation and recruit adherents, or the capability of someone like Russia to reach into our nation and try and sow political discord. So that's a little bit different in why this relates to the information environment specifically. And then I think the concept of ambiguity is a little bit different, easy to hide in the information environment. There's so much information out there. It's sometimes hard to decipher who's behind the activity, and that gets back to the concept of intent. What are they trying to achieve?
Brian David Johnson, or BDJ as he likes to be called, of Arizona State University, offers some reading suggestions for those interested in threat casting or who are interested in becoming a futurist.
The first is a new book. It just came out. It is called Burn In. It's written by P.W. Singer and August Cole. Many of your listeners may know them. They wrote Ghost Fleet. Again, it's a science fiction story based on fact. These two are amazing researchers, full transparency, they are friends of mine, and they also wrote the introduction to Invisible Force. So these do kind of tie together, but it's a really, really great work of not only sort of science fiction prototyping and kind of thinking of what the future might look like, but of scholarship as well. These two authors are notorious for having endnotes that are almost as long as the novel itself. So it's a really great resource in understanding what the future of conflict might look like. So again, that's called Burn In by P.W. Singer and August Cole, and it was just out. So a great work. But then another one that your listeners may not have heard of, and it's one that I use in all of my classes. It's the first book that all of my students have to read. So you can imagine you come to Arizona State University and here's this futurist, and you want to be a futurist, or you want to do work in foresight, sort of thinking about the future, and you're really excited. And I give you this book. This book is called Future Babble. It's written by Dan Gardner. And Future Babble is a scathing indictment of all things futurist and futures oriented. It shows the failures and where people got it really wrong. And Dan's a great writer and a journalist as well. So it's very well researched and just shows you all the perils of thinking like this and what could go wrong. But at the very end, he does say, but we still need to do this. Oftentimes we do need to think about the future. We need to think about the positive and negatives because we need to be prepared for them. So as I tell my students, if not us, then who? So we have to do this work, but there's some really great tips that he gives. And oftentimes it's what I teach students, that as we do this work, what are some things that he had learned? How do we approach this type of work, this type of thinking? And the biggest one that I teach my students is humility. That when you do this type of work and you think about this, to be humble, that it's not your job to make predictions. It's not your job to be the smartest person in the room or to be right, that it's our job to get it right. And especially if we're doing work around information warfare and security, it's our work so that we're helping organizations to be prepared for these futures. And that's really what we should do. And we need to approach it with all that humility and this idea that we can't do it alone.
Next, Dr. Boyd Brown, who was one of the founders of the Information Professionals Association, suggests a couple of books related to deception and information operations.
So I've got two for this. The first is Persuasion and Power. The author's James Farwell, and it's really a relatively recent history of influence operations and influence activities, very heavily focused on the Department of Defense. But it also spends a good bit of time talking about the role of the Department of State and national leadership with public diplomacy and strategic communication, and how, in concert with DoD, these other elements of the government come together to try to put forth a consistent message to adversaries, to friends and allies, because strategic communication and communication efforts in general are not just adversary focused. You may deceive adversaries, you may deter adversaries, but you need to reassure allies, and you need to make sure that they understand what our intentions are, and then you follow those intentions up with actions that demonstrate that we're telling them the truth. And all of that comes together in persuasion and power. So I think it's a good recent history of influence activities. And then the other is a bit more technical. It's a bit of a how-to, and this one's called "The Elements of Influence." It's by Alan Kelly, and it is really about how to conduct influence activities, and he refers to these as plays. One of the quotes from the book is, "You run plays and plays are run on you." And he breaks down a number of different techniques and tactics for deceiving, confusing adversaries in order to influence their behavior. And it's a fascinating book, and it's like I said, it's a very technical how to sort of approach to exertion of influence.
U.S. Army PSYOPs officer Major Ash Holtzman cues up some of his suggestions for a deeper dive into the world of psychological operations.
The go-to I always try to start people on is Munitions of the Mind. It's by Philip M. Taylor, and it's great. It goes into the history of propaganda. It's a lot of more of the ancient stuff, but understanding that really frames what's happening today, going back to the Catholic Church. And a lot of influence centuries ago was through churches and through religion. And yes, there was also the military applications. Those were usually through the genius of a general like Alexander the Great, or Caesar, or even the Roman Empire in general, as it was going against different nations, I guess you would call them, in their great conflicts. But also back to the Catholic Church, like that's where we get the word propaganda, is the propagation of the faith, which was an organization that the Catholic Church applied to spreading their message. And seeing how that evolved over time into today, I think really frames everything.
Next, Dr. Chris Paul, who works at the Rand Corporation, authored the influential article known as The Fire Hose of Falsehood. His suggestions for Cognitive Crucible listeners provide a deeper dive into cognition, propaganda, and policymaking.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple thoughts. I've already mentioned Jennifer Kavanaugh and Michael Rich's book on truth decay, so I'll foot stomp for that. Another book that I've enjoyed and found really useful is by Kendall Haven, and it's called Story Smart: Using the Science of Story to Persuade, Influence, Inspire, and Teach. And it's useful to information professionals in two ways. One, it does talk some about how human cognition works and some of our vulnerabilities, but it also talks about how to do positive influence, how to better communicate your research findings or your policy advice to people based on the fact that we are all humans, homo narratus, the story people. And we store information in stories and we receive information in stories, and how to leverage that. And then a final thought, if you want to geek out on propaganda stuff, the Sage Handbook of Propaganda, an edited volume by Paul Bames, Nicholas O'Shaughnessy, and Nancy Snow, back from 2019, has a lot of great articles and chapters in it.
Former congressional staffer Pete Filano shares his recommendations, which are born out of his experiences on the Hill from 2010 to 2020.
Yeah, one has guided me a lot over the years. This one is called a Fierce Domain: Conflict in Cyberspace. from 1986 to 2012. Several authors, but Jason Healy, former Air Force and now at Columbia University, is the author or the editor of this. But Fierce Domain really is I enjoyed reading this. I still reference it. It talks literally about how conflict in cyberspace has changed and how we as a country have dealt with that, including the militarization, if you will, in different ways, but also a whole slew of different interagency changes and different challenges that have come about through the years. And then the second one is, and my Microsoft colleagues will probably rib me for this, written by two folks from Microsoft, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and Peril of the Digital Age, written by Brad Smith and Carol Ann Brown. Brad is the president of the company, but this is a transformative book for me. And I read this actually when I was still in government and still with the committee. But, Brad really here and Carol Ann, they lay out a large part of what I was describing before, just in terms of the pace of technology and how fast things are moving and how the policy absolutely needs to keep pace across the board. So really transformative book for me, super helpful to understand as well the next 5 to 10 years and the challenges ahead. So I enjoyed both of those. So wanted to offer up two, if that's okay.
And finally, Dr. James Mulvinen is a cultural and disinformation scholar who leads a large team of Chinese and Russian linguists for SOS International.
The Cambridge Analytica book, Mindfuck, by Chris Wiley. And the reason I recommend that book, even though we've been talking about China and Russia the whole time, is because it was really eye-opening to me. Some of the analysis, academic, behavioral, psychological analysis that underlay Cambridge Analytica's strategies in 2015 and 2016 that allowed them to have such a disproportionate effect on the US election. And just to understand that it's these same dynamics that are described in that book that are being exploited by the Russians and Chinese in their IO in the West. Now I will say that I'm just as concerned about Western surveillance capitalism as I am about Chinese and Russian IO. So I sort of view them as two sides of the same coin. And so, I think it's just as important to read Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism as it is to read Mindfuck. But I think if you read those two books together in concert, you'd have a pretty good understanding of the major strategic dilemmas that we now face in the information space.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.